The KLH Model 5 might just be the safest purchase you can make if you're interested in speakers that have this retro throwback look. Why do I say that? Well, there's a lot of reasons, and we're going to talk about those in this video. Audiophiles unite. Seriously, how many times have you seen a KLH Model 5 video? Probably more than you can count. You probably don't even care about my opinion, but just in case you do, I'm going to give it to you. I'm going to talk about some data that I collected from these speakers, and then talk about the number of ways that you can set them up for your room. And those are factors into why I say that this might just be the safest purchase that you can make. Now, how much do I like them, and do I like them more than the Wharfedale Lintons? Well, we're going to save that for another video. I like them just fine after some finagling. These speakers retail for about $2,500 a pair, and I gotta say, when I received them from their owner, who shipped them to me brand new in box, so they were fully broken in over the span of like a week and a half, plenty of time breaking them in. The manual even says 8 hours, and that's adequate. Basically, KLH is saying you don't really have to break these speakers in, but if you want to, hey, throw 8 hours of music at it, you'll be all right. And that's one thing that I really like about the manual here. It's no nonsense. It's pretty straight to the point. They give you a lot of tips and pointers on how to set these speakers up for different listening environments. And with that said, I do believe that this is probably one of the best manuals I've seen. I hate manuals that when you open them up, there's no information. They don't really tell you anything about the speakers. They expect you to just know how to set them up. And I cannot tell you the number of times that I have set up a speaker in a way that I expect the speaker would be designed to be listened to, and then find out after the fact that, oh yeah, you're supposed to do this thing. Well, it's like, dude, tell your audience, tell your customer base how you design the speaker to be listened to, and we won't have these issues. With that aside, yes, this manual takes care of all those things, and I'll give you a couple examples here. In this manual, they talk about the aiming, and they say you can sit between about plus or minus 20 degrees of the speakers horizontally. So you can toe them in or toe them out, pretty much however you've seen fit to set them up in your room, because your room can be very impactful upon the sound that you're going to hear. For example, this speaker is very wide radiating, which means it's going to have a lot of reflections off the sidewall. If you want to reduce the sidewall reflections, then you toe them in, aim them a little bit more on axis directly toward your listening position. And then in doing so, you get more direct sound versus reflected sound. That allows you less sidewall reflections, but it also provides you with a little bit tighter imaging. Now, the opposite of that is typically true. If you aim these particular speakers out away from you, so let's say they're aimed directly at you, and then you tilt them out so they're facing more into the room and firing straight out into the room, well, now you've got more sidewall reflections, and the benefit of that is you might have some more soundstage width. That's something I really enjoy. But that comes at a cost of imaging. Well, this manual tells you all that. How cool is that? I think that's the first manual that I've seen that really breaks that stuff down to a level that's usable by the customer. Another thing is that this particular speaker comes with a low, medium, and high switch, which you see in this image. And what I've done is I've grabbed a screenshot of the manual that provides you with information about what these switches do. The high position, they say, is the default. Well, that's how they showed up. So yes, this is the preferred selection for neutral to dead listening spaces. And then going down to the low position, the response above about 400 hertz is attenuated by about 3 dB. That, they say, is more preferred for a room that might be more lively. So what they've done is they've attenuated the mid and high frequency and given you less SPL at those higher frequencies. You've got a little bit more low bass relative to those mid-high frequencies. The interesting thing, though, is reading this manual, it tells me basically that I should set this speaker up in the high mode because I have a pretty dead room. That doesn't work for me. And I really did not like the sound out of these speakers. And my initial thought was, no, why are people liking these speakers, right? That was my initial thought. So then I tried some of the other settings. I tried the mid and the high, and I thought, well, these are a lot better. Or I should say the mid and the low, and I thought these are a lot better. And then I even tried it with the grills on. And then when I put the grills on, that made a difference as well, because the grill helps to attenuate the higher frequencies. And when you set the switch to low or medium, then you also attenuate the mid-range as well as the high frequency. So in my particular system, the low and the mid settings were the two that I like the most with the grill on. Now, as far as aiming the speaker, I actually preferred the speaker to be towed out just a little bit by about 10 degrees. Now, that strikes a good balance between reflections in the room, because remember, this is already a very wide radiating speaker at about plus or minus 80 to plus or minus 70 degrees. And it allows me to not lose so much focus of images. And that's something that you're always going to have to give up with a wide radiating speaker. Conversely, a narrow radiating speaker like a tight horn pattern would sound more precise in the imaging, but it's not going to sound as wide of a soundstage. And I prefer the wider soundstage, and I'm willing to accept the trade-off of less precise imaging. These are just personal things. Now you know where I'm coming from. Another aspect to consider, however, is that with these switch selections, you're attenuating the mid and high frequency relative to the low frequency. The 400 hertz area is kind of the split. And what I'm seeing in the data, and what actually makes sense when I listen to it, having seen the data, is that these speakers are said to be used from about like 6 to 24 inches off a wall. Well, in my room, I don't have that luxury. I've got a false wall, and it's not completely solid wall. And therefore, when I demo speakers in my home theater, they have to be placed off a back wall. And this is like 3.5 feet. With these speakers, there is a baffle step difference in the low mid bass to upper mid bass, around 200 or 300 hertz. Normally, when you put a speaker close to a wall, I'm not talking right up on top of it, but close to a wall, you get some boundary reinforcement, and it's going to be in those lower frequencies. The further away you move the speaker from the wall, the less boundary reinforcement you get. And the more neutral the speaker is likely to sound if it's designed to be listened that way. But since these speakers are designed to be listened close to a wall, that baffle step is part of the design. Well, when I use the high setting, that difference in frequency matching is very prevalent. But if I set it to the low or the mid setting, well, that mismatch is attenuated a little bit. So they're brought up in level. Now the low mid bass to high mid bass transition area is more level matched, and it sounds more neutral in my room. So what I'm saying all that for is, don't think of just the low, mid, and high settings to be for the mid to high frequency attenuation for the room, for the liveliness or the deadness of your room. Also consider it if you have to pull the speakers away from the wall for some reason like I do. Using those low and mid settings will actually help you out a good bit in those instances. Now that we've established the setting that I use, which was primarily low in my listening, with the grill on, slightly off axis by about 10 degrees, I'm going to talk about what I heard with that most ideal setting. What I heard was mostly a neutral sound. And when I say mostly, there were still a few things that bothered me about what I was hearing. One is the low mid bass still just wasn't as punchy as I would prefer. And that's still attributed to that slight mismatch in the baffle step region around 200 hertz, where the low mid bass was about 1.5 to 3 dB lower than the mid range. And because of that, I don't have that sound of that punch. I don't have the harmonics of that punch. I don't have the lower vocal taking precedent like it should in certain tracks. Now, again, this in my part was due more to placement. And then when I moved the speakers downstairs into my living room, placed them near a wall, that wasn't as prevalent, but still it was noticeable. So that's something that you'll want to keep in mind, especially if you are keeping these in the high setting in your room, but near a wall, you're still going to have that little bit of a mismatch. I also noticed a distinct sound in the 2 to 4 kilohertz area, which is kind of right in that tweeter to mid-range crossover region. And I don't see anything in the frequency response data that lends me to believe that that's what I was hearing. But I do see something in the harmonic distortion data that stands out a little bit in that area. And I thought, maybe that's what I'm hearing. Now, the estimated in-room response shows a little bit of a plateau around 2 to 4 kilohertz. And I thought, well, it's possible that I'm hearing it. But I got to be honest, it's one of those things where maybe if I listen to it a week from now, I wouldn't notice it. I can't say for sure that's going to be a problem for you. If you own these speakers, I would be curious to hear what you think about that and if you've noticed anything like that. I also noticed a little bit of a resonance in some of the music that I was listening to around 800 hertz. So I said 800 hertz. When I went and looked at the data, it showed up around 900 hertz. There's a clear impedance blip right there. So I am certain that's what I was hearing. Now, it wasn't a big deal, but to my critical ears, you know, listening critically, that was noticeable. If I were just sitting back, relaxing, and maybe playing with the dogs or something and had music going, I probably wouldn't notice it. But I'm telling you, so maybe you can be aware of it. The width of the speaker is awesome. I mentioned earlier that it's about plus or minus 70 to 80 degrees wide. Plenty of soundstage width. And one thing that I noticed in a couple tracks that was really peculiar is that with music that's panned far left or far right, the soundstage would actually be deeper on the far sides of the soundstage, meaning that let's say I had a sound that was far off to this side, and the typical soundstage depth might be like this, right? Well, you could hear the discontinuity between here and here. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but discontinuity is the only word I can think to use. As you got back toward the center of the soundstage, it didn't sound as deep there. And that's interesting. Now, I've heard that in some other systems. Typically, what I refer to that is horseshoeing. And horseshoeing of the soundstage will be where it kind of bends out and comes further out in the center, but closer to you at the edges. But this is a little bit different because even though it's closer to me at the edges, it's still also deep depending on what tracks I'm listening to. Now remember, the music is the source that contains the soundstage. The speakers are just trying to replicate that soundstage as best they can. And your room and your aiming and all of that stuff has an effect on what the source material is going to sound like in your room. So I'm mentioning that because I find it very interesting, and I'm curious if any of you owners have heard that as well. Long story short, while I initially did not care for the speakers, that was with the grill off, and that was in the high setting. After playing around with the speakers, playing around with the toe in, playing around with the different settings, and putting the grill on, what I landed on was most of the time low setting, grill on, speakers toed out about 10 degrees. And after that, I really started to like these speakers more and more. And the little issues that I just noted are pretty minor. Now that the subjective opinion is done, let's put that to the side. And I want to jump into the data, and I'm going to try to correlate a couple of those little things and focus on what the data shows us, because the data matters. I know some people think that measurements don't matter, and I think a lot of that is just because you're used to looking at incomplete measurements. What we need are measurements of the entire speaker's sound field, 360 degrees, above and around, above, below, around, side to side, all of that stuff. We need all of that to help really characterize the performance of the speaker, because one single on-axis measurement or one single measurement in somebody's room is never enough. You really need a lot of different measurements to put together the puzzle. And that's what I have. So I'm using Klippel's near field scanner. It allows you full spherical response of the speaker gathered anechoically in a non-anechoic environment. And why do you want that? Again, we want to separate the speaker from the room. We want to be able to identify problems in the response or things that you may like in the response. And in doing so, it helps you become a better informed purchaser. The reference plane is at the tweeter, and after doing a poll on my YouTube page, I found most people listen to this speaker with the mid setting on and with the grill on. Right here, we have the CEA 2034 dataset. This is the industry standard, and it provides us with the on-axis response as well as the overall sound power response and the early reflections and a lot more information that you need. So I'm going to try to hit the highlights here. The speaker sensitivity is mid. I'd say it's about 85 dB at 2.83 volts, 1 meter. Baffle step issue around 200 hertz, which I discussed pretty heavily earlier. The overall on-axis linearity is rather poor, but when you start going off-axis, those diffraction issues that we have from the cabinet, they start to dissipate, and you wind up with a pretty nice estimated in-room response. The F3 and F10 are at 52 hertz and 32 hertz respectively, so the speaker does a pretty decent job of giving you good low bass in a room. Now, if you want the lowest of bass, you're certainly going to need a subwoofer. I think that comes as no surprise to anybody, but for the majority of music, you're probably going to be okay. This is the estimated in-room response. So this is a pretty good prediction of what you can expect to hear in your room with these settings. Again, the mid and the grill on. And then if I draw a trend line through the response, there's a couple things that I'll note here. The mid bass area. So this is absolutely what I was hearing. There's a little bit of a discrepancy between the upper mid bass and the lower mid bass region. And that's where I went in and would prefer to apply some EQ or tonal balance to kind of level those out. But If you are listening these speakers near a wall like you're supposed to, then this will be less of an issue and that'll kind of fill in naturally. And then you'll want to go back to playing around with the tonal controls on your own. The high frequency fall off right here, I think, gives credence to the notion that many call these speakers warm. The way I define warm is relative from high frequency to mid-range. If the high frequency rolls off and there's more mid-range presence, then I would define that as being a warm sound. This is the horizontal radiation. Now, 0 degrees down here is dead on axis with the tweeter. And we can see this speaker is about plus or minus 70 to 80 degrees wide. That's very wide radiation, but in my opinion, it doesn't really have an issue with losing a lot of focus. If you aim them completely off axis, like 30 degrees facing straight out into the room, yes, you're going to give up a good bit of focus. But with the setting that I use these in, aiming them a little bit more toward me, yielded really nice wide radiation, but also good imaging. So this is another area that I think KLH does a great job in their manual. And I'll reference back to what I mentioned earlier about the whole trade-off of toe in versus toe out, reflections versus image precision. This is the vertical response. 0 degrees is dead on axis with the tweeter. The one thing that's very interesting about the speaker is your window is very, very tight. You want to be pretty much on axis with the tweeter, and that's where the stands that tilt the speaker back about 5 degrees comes in handy, because without those, the tweeter would just be aiming at your gut. Nobody wants to hear that. But with the stand aiming the tweeter back, then you have the benefit of the tweeter aimed at your ears. Now let's talk about output. This is 96 dB harmonic distortion. You can see that I've drawn the lines of negative 40 dB and negative 30 dB, which are 1% and 3% distortion respectively. And for the most part, the speaker stays within 1% distortion, which is pretty dang good at 96 dB. But notice this area right here around 2 kilohertz. That's what I was talking about earlier when I said I heard some harshness at higher volume. And I kind of wonder, is this it? I don't know, but I wonder. Let's talk about compression. Compression looks pretty good at most volumes until you get to the highest output volume where the tweeter starts to have pretty significant compression above here. Let's talk about multitone distortion, which is different than harmonic distortion. Multitone distortion is distortion tested where it's playing a whole bunch of frequencies at the same time, and it's done to simulate music. If you're interested in learning more about why multitone distortion is much more important to use than harmonic distortion, click this card up here. I talk about it in about 30 minutes worth of talking, so check that out if you want to. Otherwise, I'll just note that the multitone distortion looks pretty good. Now we're going to go through a couple things pretty quickly. I measured the high setting with the grill on versus the grill off, and the grill off is in black, the grill on is in blue. We can see a difference here. So the speaker on axis measures better with the grill off, but in the overall scheme of things, when you're talking about the reflected sound and the direct sound, the grill off helps to tame the high frequency, and it's really not problematic. It doesn't show the dips that you see on axis alone. So I prefer the grill off. This is the estimated in-room response of the 3 different settings: the low, the mid, and the high setting. The high setting is in blue, mid is in red, and low is in black. And you can see the effect of those settings, how they come into play. So that's it for this review. There's a lot of ground to cover. I try to get through it kind of quickly, but I hope that you learned something about the speaker. And more so, I hope you learned a little bit more about how acoustics works. Because if I had just shown you the data and you had just seen that dip between the mid-range and the mid-bass around 200 hertz, that baffle step, I think most of you would think, well, that doesn't look right. That can't sound good. But then we remember KLH says 6 to 24 inches off the back wall. Well, that helps smooth that in some. Now, it does create a couple other little issues when you put a speaker near a wall. But in this particular case, I think that's what they were going for, was they were trying to, number one, go for a speaker that wasn't obtrusive, right? Because they have them on stands, they have them sitting low, so they're not sitting really high above you. They're not huge, towering speakers. And then you can also put them near a wall. So they designed some baffle step compensation in. In my case, I don't have that luxury of putting them next to a wall in my home theater. I do in my living room, so I listen to them in both situations. And in my home theater, I preferred the low setting because it helps fix that a little bit. And then we have the grill on versus grill off. I mean, there's no way that I would enjoy these speakers with the grill off. I just wouldn't. But if you only look at the on-axis response, then some people would say, hey, you can only listen to the speaker with the grill off because there's too much diffraction from the side of the cabinet, the edges where the grill is inset. But if you know enough about acoustics and you know how the measurements matter, then you know to go look at everything else. You know to look at the off-axis response to the side and how that reflects out into the room and comes back to your ears. All of that sums up to make a more neutral sound when you have the grill on, at least for my ears. And the data backs that up as well because you attenuate the high frequencies a little bit. Now, everybody is a little bit different. Everybody prefers a little bit different. And I think this speaker might be the most trouble-free as far as setting things up and walking away. I prefer the Wharfedale Lintons more, and I would buy that speaker before I would buy this speaker. But I know my room, I understand it, and the Wharfedale Lintons are a good match for my room. If you've tried the Wharfedale Lintons and you didn't like them, and you've tried this and maybe you did, well, maybe now you understand why. These KLHs have a lot of features that you can play around with to get the best possible sound. And that's why I say it's probably the safest choice for audiophiles, because you can buy the speaker and you're not left with just one option for listening to it. You can put the grill on, you can turn them off axis. Well, yes, you can do that with pretty much any speaker, but now you also have the option of the low, medium, and high settings where you can attenuate the high frequency and mid frequency response to get them to work with your room. Now, this speaker isn't perfect by any means. No speaker ever is. And again, there are some things I heard about it that would probably keep me from not purchasing it altogether. But when you weigh the aspect of being able to fine tune the speaker, I think that's what makes this a safe buy. If you are totally not afraid of equalization and you like DSP, well, then there may be better options for you, and maybe the KLH isn't something that would work for you. And then I would probably say, hey, dude, I like the Wharfedale and you can save some money. But if you are one of the purists out there who have your amplifier and you don't want anything else getting in the signal chain between your awesome sounding amplifier and your speakers, then I think the KLH makes the most sense. Now get ready. Here comes the cheap plug. You've already heard me say that I wouldn't personally purchase this speaker. And you've heard me note a couple things that I don't like about it, but you've also heard me say there are some really interesting things about it that might make it a good speaker for you. If you are considering purchasing this speaker or any other speaker that I've reviewed, please consider going through my affiliate link, which I'll have in the description below. It doesn't cost you any extra money, but it does help me out with a small commission, and that allows me to keep doing what I'm doing. As a matter of fact, I purchased 4 small bookshelf speaker sets today to review. And I'm able to do that through your help, either through PayPal donation, Patreons. Thank you a whole lot to my patrons out there, and affiliate linking. So if you want to help me out in one of those 3 ways, I'll have information below in the description and you can check that out. Whew. With that said, I am out. I hope you all learned something. I hope you appreciate it, and I'll see you in the next one. Probably going to be a direct comparison with the Wharfedale because I know that's what most of you want to see, but I had to do all this first to get to that next step. We'll talk to you all later. Take care. Peace.